Today, we're diving into a landmark case in international trade law that honestly, every law student absolutely has to know. It all kicks off with something as simple as a cup of coffee, but believe me, this dispute completely reshaped how we understand one of the most critical rules in all of global trade. So if you've got an international law exam on the horizon, you're going to want to listen up. It really all boils down to this one question. You and I might think about coffee in terms of, where it's from or how it tastes. But under the old rules of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, the answer to this question has massive, massive economic consequences. This case really forced the issue, making the world's trade body decide what actually makes two products alike. So here's our game plan for this explainer. We'll start with the basic facts of what happened. Then we'll dig into Brazil's legal argument and, of course, Spain's defense. After that, we get to the really juicy part for your exam prep, the legal tests that the GATT panel created. And then we'll wrap it up by looking at the verdict and why this case still matters so much today.
Okay, let's set the scene. It's 1979, and Spain decides to change its import rules. This move immediately catches the eye of one of the world's biggest coffee producers, Brazil. And this is where our story really gets going.
This little table here is the heart of the entire dispute. See, before 1980, all unroasted coffee came into Spain totally duty-free, 0% tariff. But this new law split coffee into different categories. Mild coffees, they were still free. But unwashed Arabica and Robusta coffees, bam, they got hit with a new 7% tariff. Now, that might not sound like a huge deal, but for a coffee powerhouse like Brazil, this was a major economic punch. And here's exactly why it was such a big deal. Right after this new tariff kicked in, Brazil was supplying over 28% of all the raw coffee coming into Spain. And can you guess what kind of coffee Brazil was famous for exporting? Yep, unwashed Arabica, the exact type that was suddenly being taxed. The financial stakes here were just massive. Brazil, they didn't waste any time. They filed a complaint right away, tried to talk it out with Spain in formal consultations, but those talks just went nowhere. By June of 1980, Brazil had pretty much hit a diplomatic dead end and requested a formal dispute panel under the GATT rules. The stage was officially set for a big legal showdown. So what was Brazil's legal angle here? Well, it all centered on the cornerstone principle of the entire GATT system, non-discrimination. This is the idea that keeps global trade from just becoming a chaotic free-for-all. It's supposed to ensure a level playing field. And that principle is called Most Favored Nation, or MFN. Now, for your exams, this is a concept you have to know inside and out. GATT Article 1.1 basically says, no playing favorites. If you give one country a special deal, like a 0% tariff, you have to give that exact same deal to all other GATT members for any like products. The keywords there are immediately, unconditionally, and the one that drives this whole case, like products. And this is the exact legal language they were fighting over. Brazil's whole argument was that Spain was giving an advantage, that sweet 0% tariff, to coffee from some countries, but not to the like product from others, namely Brazil. The entire case was going to pivot on how the panel defined that one little phrase, like product. Brazil's argument was just beautifully simple. They said, look, all unroasted coffee is basically the same stuff. It's a like product. So by creating these different categories with different tariffs, Spain was clearly breaking the MFN rule. It was a clean, powerful claim. So how did Spain respond to that? Well, their entire defense was built on one single make-or-break argument, that these different kinds of coffee were not, in fact, like products. So let's flip the coin and look at their side of the story. Spain came to the table with a whole list of reasons why these coffees were different. As you can see, they pointed to how they were processed. One is washed, the other unwashed. They argued that the mild coffees had a better taste and smell. They even got into the weeds, talking about different chemical compositions and how they sold for different prices on the world market. Their bottom line was, these are two distinct, unlike products, so the MFN rule just doesn't apply here. But Brazil had a comeback for every single point. They were like, hold on, all these beans come from the same kind of plant. They argued that all those differences in taste and smell were just because of geography and processing, not because the products themselves were fundamentally different. And crucially, Brazil pointed out that the end use is identical. It's all just ground up to make a drink called coffee. Plus, roasters mix them all together in blends all the time. Spain also tried this other argument, sort of a plan B. They claimed the whole policy was for a domestic reason. It was supposedly an anti-inflation measure to keep the price down on the mild coffee that they said Spanish people liked more. But as Brazil correctly shot back, a country's internal policy goals don't just give you a free pass to break your international treaty promises. So you've got strong arguments from both Brazil and Spain. How in the world did the panel figure this out? Okay, now this is the most important part of this whole explainer for your exam. The panel didn't just pick a side. They created a legal test to figure out what a like product actually is. The panel's decision came down to this really elegant three-part analysis. First, they looked at the properties of the product itself. And now they admitted there were differences in taste and smell, but they decided those weren't big enough to make them unlike. Second, and this was a huge one, they looked at the end use. The fact that all these beans ended up as the exact same beverage was super important to them. And third, they looked around at what other countries were doing, and they noticed that no other GATT country was making this kind of distinction in their tariffs. This three-part framework is the huge legacy of this case, and it's what you really need to remember. So, using that three-part test, the panel was able to come to a really clear and decisive conclusion. And this is the moment where we see legal precedent being created right before our eyes. Yep, the panel found that Spain was in clear violation of its obligations under the GATT. By trying to slice and dice coffee into these artificial categories based on pretty minor differences, Spain had broken one of the cardinal rules of global trade. The official ruling was crystal clear. Unroasted coffee, no matter what you call it or how you process it, is a like product under Article 1.1. And because of that, Spain's different tariffs were a textbook case of illegal discrimination against Brazil and other coffee exporters. And that led to another critical legal takeaway. The panel said Spain's action was a prima facie case of nullification or impairment. Now, that sounds like a bunch of legal jargon, but it's a super important concept for your exam. It basically means if you break a rule, the harm is assumed. Brazil didn't have to go and prove exactly how much money they lost. The burden of proof flipped to Spain to prove that their rule breaking caused zero harm, which is, almost impossible to do. So in the end, the recommendation from the panel was pretty straightforward. They simply asked Spain to fix its tariff system and bring it back in line with its MFN obligations. In other words, treat all coffee equally. So let's recap the key points for your exam. This case is a giant for three big reasons. First, it gave us that super influential three-part test for figuring out like products. Second, it confirmed that the MFN rule applies to all tariffs, not just the ones that countries have formally negotiated. And third, it hammered home that critical legal idea that breaking a rule is, on its face, presumed to cause harm. This case from 1981 about coffee beans really set the gold standard, but it also leaves us with a huge modern challenge. With technology creating brand new products every single day, think about lab-grown meat or synthetic fuels, this question of what is like something else just gets more and more complicated. The ideas from the coffee case are still where we start, but this debate, it is far from over.